It's a big world out there. Welcome to Bigfoot's Wilderness Podcast.
Never will I forget the time I saw one. I was pretty small. Being that I was a kid, I wanted to believe my parents and that it was the wind, but the wind doesn't approach with heavy thuds and grunts. This thing sounded big and menacing, and I could hear it approaching on most nights. In my room, there used to be an air conditioning unit, but we'd recently installed central air conditioning as our smaller window units couldn't keep up with the hot and humid summer seasons. There were times in summer that the Washington heat could be oppressive. There was a metal screen on the window, which was used to help hold the unit and was still pushed up. Only a thin layer of glass and a frilly curtain stood between me and what could be outside. I've actually read recently about people that say Bigfoot can speak to them telepathically. I don't think that was the case with me, but it got to the point that it was scratching and scraping at my window almost every night that summer. It always seemed like it was around 4 a.m. Sometimes this thing would meow like a cat or make a growl or barking noise like a dog. Once I heard a scream that sounded like someone was being murdered. My dad explained it away as a cougar. Was this thing toying with me or just trying to play? I can only tell you that at this point, my imagination was running wild. As I mentioned, I didn't always hear it, and maybe it didn't always approach the house, but usually I was asleep and would awaken to the scratching, which would then send me flying down the hallway to my parents' room where I'd spend the rest of my night. They knew everything about the monster, as I shared every detail. So logically, when I'd come running into the bedroom, my dad would usually groan out something like, "Come on, Dougie." Towards the end of summer, my mom and dad were fit to be tied as they had both told me incessantly that 1, there was no such thing as monsters, and 2, I needed to sleep in my own room. My dad was a very large man, about 6'7", and worked for a logging company. He always said, "I'm the only monster in this house, Dougie." I tried my best to believe that statement, but as bedtime would arrive and the usual good night and a tuck-in, I always started out in my bedroom, but on this night, after careful consideration, I decided to bring some extra things to bed. Even though I was a little older, I'd had a survival guide, so to say, that I would use in reference to help me fight back against my cowardliness. I think it was called "There's a Monster Under My Bed," or something like that. It was a kid's book that I dug out from my bookshelf. I'd borrowed my dad's high-powered flashlight, a whistle, and an old gun that we used for target shooting. I called it my trusty .22. The anxiety I felt made me hope that I was finally going to get rid of this monster once and for all. My plan was not parent-approved, and I shut my door, which I never did, and kept all the lights off, which I never do, as my flashlight would hopefully temporarily blind him, and then I'd probably shoot him. But first, I wanted to see it, and then I'd shoot it. Later that night, around 4 a.m., the scratching began. I was ready to give up the plan and head straight for my parents' bed yet again, but somehow I got my fear in control, and my curiosity made me want to pull that curtain back. I think it was the confidence of holding my rifle. As I slid the curtain over, I turned on the flashlight. I'd finally see it. It pulled back, seemingly cowering as I saw its arm raise. Attempting to block the beam of light, its stringy arm draped down its body. The size of this thing made me gasp. It took up the whole window, and then some. It was even bent down. It looked like a caveman crossed with a chimpanzee. It had black eyes, and its face just looked weird. The head was a shallow slope like a chimp, and a very heavy eyebrow ridge too. Most of the face was covered in hair, but even with so much hair, I could see an expression, one that seemed all too familiar. My dad gave me that look on occasion. Sometimes I'd even get it from my mom. It was a look of disappointment. It glared at the rifle that I was pointing in its face. It knew what a gun was, and it was now leaving. But in defense of my own actions, this thing scared me every night over a whole summer, even on my birthday as I turned 12. I hated it, and because no one believed me, I had to do something from the safety of my room, of course. My dad woke up after hearing the commotion. He'd opened the door only to see me spotlighting out the window, but the creature had already started its retreat back to the forest. At my pleading, Dad even went outside to search for the monster. A few minutes later, he came back to my room and was very understanding for 4 a.m. in the morning. I finally aired things out even more and talked about monsters, and then we talked about more serious stuff like the fact that school was starting soon. We talked until the sun rose, and then we all got dressed and went out for breakfast. Mom didn't say much, she just listened. Upon returning home, a good-sized tree that bordered our driveway had fallen over, blocking us from entering our property. It was also the tree my rope swing hung from. We'd been gone an hour, if that. There weren't any storms or wind. It was a head-scratcher for sure. Once in a while, I'd hear a hoot or a yell, and twice that I can remember, there was an unexplainable slap on the house, but I never heard or saw it approach my window again. Years later, and I'm looking back on this event, I'm writing my story for my college literature class. The professor wants to judge our writing skills and ask us to write a story about the most profound moment in our young lives. After returning our stories a few days later, he pulls me aside and tells me how fascinated he was with what I'd written. He'd asked me, point blank, if it was true, as if to challenge me. Yes, I said, every word. He shook his head and said, "You're from Washington State, right?" Well, from everything I've read and heard, you just might be telling the truth. You never said or mentioned it was a Bigfoot, but what else could it have been? I know I have that paper somewhere from my freshman year. I never throw anything away. He wrote a comment on my paper that said, "Are you serious? We need to talk." I have one other story that may or may not be related to Bigfoot. It's not definitive in that it's Bigfoot, but what else could it have been? This is the age-old question. My girlfriend's father at the time had a rather large piece of property, and he invited me to do some camping, just he and I. A couple of things changed last minute, as he wouldn't be able to camp that Friday night. But I decided to go anyway, even though I'd seemed to have picked up a cold. I was sneezing, coughing, you know the routine. Well, I sneezed and coughed the roughly 1 mile I had to trek into the designated spot. Even though my ears had that fluid you get, I noticed 2 things right off the bat. 1, not an animal or bug was chattering. And 2, someone was chopping wood, although the noises were very infrequent. Maybe once, and then a little while later, another one. I made a small fire and tried to enjoy a hot meal, but I felt better lying down. Once I was on my cot, I drift in and out of sleep. I could feel a sore throat coming. I'd forgotten to pack my first aid kit, but I knew that Jenny's dad would have one. I'd just have to power through it. Maybe I could just drink some hot water. Later in the night, as my head got hotter and my throat got tighter, something peculiar happened. I heard a cough, and then another. I stood up, trying to see something. Flashlights, anything. I shouted out, but no one responded. Even with the fluid in my ears, I heard that cough. And there it was again. It was just too dark. Feeling kind of miserable, I took my hot water to bed and just kind of curled up with it while trying to bundle what blankets I had as well. On a clear moonlit night, I saw a giant hand press against the tent and then grab the top of my two-person teepee. As it gently swayed, I thought it must be my fever. I'd been in and out of consciousness, but still caressed my empty cup of water. There was that cough again, and then something brushed by the tent. "Who's there?" I checked my watch. It was around 1 a.m. Unzipping the flap, something almost fell into the tent. It was a branch, and the branch was full of pine needles. Okay, what just happened? Did a tree fall? There was no noise. What's this doing here? I now had that hoarse cough. Oh, my throat even hurt worse. But as cloudy as my head was, it suddenly came to me that I could maybe make some tea with those pine needles. I'll credit my dad for telling me, as only he would have known, as he'd spent so much time outdoors in all weather in every season. I had a knife and another cup. I could make this work. Boiling some more water and drenching the cut needles for 10 or so minutes while letting it properly seep, the first thing I noticed was the pleasant smell and taste. I drank 2 cups before heading back off to sleep. I trailed off to screams in the night. I can remember trying to turn the TV off and then fade to black. But then apparently, sometime during the night, I sent an incoherent text message to Jenny's dad, who arrived at the campsite around 10 a.m. the next morning. It was kind of an icebreaker, as he chuckled and showed me the text. It said something like, "Wild man, medicine, broken branches, fade out." "Just what were you smoking up here?" Jenny's dad commented. No, I'm sick." "Oh man, that's too bad. I've got some Tylenol in my first aid kit. Want some?" While my last encounter was bizarre, when you live in a state like Washington, some are okay with Bigfoot encounters. While I can't prove it was, I'd like to think it could have been. And to jump back to my first encounter briefly, I now know that my mom knew more than she let on. Just a year ago, she told me of finding footprints in the snow when I was a kid, and they were much larger than my dad's feet, but for some reason, she wasn't really afraid. My mother was part Skokomish Indian. Although a very small amount, she had her beliefs and wanted to leave this ancient presence alone. However, if the creature had sought to hurt me, she assured me that she would have protected me at all costs. It's funny. After you're all grown up and your parents retell your childhood to you, it doesn't always seem so desperate as you may have made it out to be. But in your mind, it was life or death. Bigfoot will always be a part of my past, and respectfully, I'd like to keep him there, in my past. Every spring, my family and another family we were very close with would pack up and head to Willow for a week to fish for salmon in the Deshka and Little Susitna rivers. One particularly rainy and cold spring, my father, brother, and I were pulling in salmon after salmon when a nasty, skunky, musky smell floated toward us. It suddenly dawned on me that most of the other fishing families had quietly and quickly disappeared. Our close friend had always fished with a shotgun by his side. My own father was armed with a Colt .45, and now he unsnapped the holster and quietly told us to reel in our gear and pack up. Since we'd only been fishing for about an hour and it wasn't anywhere near dark, all of us kids were a little confused. But knowing not to question our dads when they gave us an order, we did as we were told. I whispered to my dad, asking what was wrong. He whispered back, "Bear." But I wasn't so sure. I had never smelled a bear like that. As we were crossing over the railroad bridge, I remember looking back at some trees that had been uprooted and then stuck in the ground upside down. I often wondered why and how someone could do that. I learned many years later that that was a telltale sign of Bigfoot territory. I guess I'll never know if that was a bear or a Bigfoot that displaced us from fishing that evening. But I do know that was the last time our families ever fished that river. It was also the first and only time all the kids got to sleep, or at least tried to, in the camp trailer instead of the tents. My dad and I had set up our blue two-man tent in this grassy clearing about 25 yards south of the house. It was night, and our friend's 3 children had gone to the loft bedrooms and were awake talking a bit. My dad and our hosts were downstairs talking at the north end of the house. I visited with the other kids for a while upstairs. I didn't want to go to bed out in the tent while everyone else was having a good time talking. Then I went downstairs and sat with the adults for a while. Around 10:30, Dad sent me off to bed. I went reluctantly. The moon was out, and it was so late, so I believe it was a partial moon, and if memory serves, there were some clouds that were scuttling across otherwise clear, star-filled skies. The yard light put out a fair amount of light, so that I could see my way to the tent easily. The front of the tent faced the house, and thus the yard light as well. I opened the tent, got in, and zipped the mosquito net closed. I took my pants and shirt off, leaving my underwear on, and then I started to read a book without the aid of a flashlight. The light was coming in was enough. After about 20 minutes, I was getting sleepy. Don't remember if I was still reading or not when I heard footsteps in the grass coming toward the tent. I sat up, thinking Dad must be coming to bed. But the steps were coming from my left, from the west. The house was north of me. The steps came nearer, quiet on the grass, but unmistakable footsteps. Then, to my surprise, the shadow of 2 legs walking from left to right in front of the tent were cast on the tent fabric, and then the mosquito netting. By the yard light, I saw the silhouette of the 2 legs from waist down as they passed. Whoever made them came very near as they passed, within 10 feet. The steps moved off to the right a bit, perhaps 30 to 40 feet, where there was bush cover, and were silent. I called out, "Dad, is that you?" No answer. About this time, the hairs on the back of my neck began to prickle, and a lump formed in my throat. My pulse was pounding. I was surprised at my sudden fear, but it had a hold of me absolutely. I thought it out in an instant. Why should I be afraid? No one here would hurt me, and we were far from any neighbors. "Dad, are you out there?" Not expecting a response. Yet the footsteps began again, starting from where they stopped to my right and coming towards the tent again. I froze. I was practically choking in fear. I thought something bad was going to happen. The shadow of the walking legs was again cast on the tent door, this time moving to the left. The footsteps moved off to the left a bit and were quiet. Were they gone, or were they waiting only a short distance away, waiting for me to do something? I don't know. They couldn't have gone far. I waited about 5 minutes trying to breathe silently, listening with every part of me. Then I couldn't stand it any longer. I pulled on my jeans, pulled open the zipper of the tent, and looking only straight ahead, bolted at top speed into the house. Hollering alarm once inside, Dad and our friends were right where I left them. I told them what had happened, and they assured me that they had been there all along. They also said that none of the kids had been down from the upstairs. I went upstairs and found the kids where I left them in bed. Upon hearing what had happened, they swore they knew nothing about it. I believed them. I also believed the older folks. The parents tried to tell me it was an overactive imagination, and perhaps the moon casting the shadow of a cloud on the tent. The legs of my visitor were a biped. They were large, tall. The stride, as I saw it, was smooth and steady. It was quite possibly a person, but what a person would be doing snooping around a remote farmstead, miles from any town in the middle of the night, quarter-mile from even a road, I don't know. I noticed no smell at all. I decided to contribute this experience as being of possible interest after reading of another interloper sighting in the same area, around the same year of 1984. This incident took place in Superior National Forest, St. Louis County, Minnesota. Hey everyone, have a great night. Hope you enjoyed the stories. And we'll get to an interview the following week, most likely, with some more stories included. If you get a chance, check out Bigfoot's Wilderness on Teespring. The link will be in the show notes. Also, Bigfoot Frightening Encounters, episodes 1, 2, and 3, maybe I should call them books 1, 2, and 3, are narrated by me, so please check them out. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Hope you all have a great night. Take care.